During the Reconstruction era, African Americans in the former slave-holding states saw education as an important step towards achieving equality, independence, and prosperity. As a result, they found ways to learn despite the many obstacles that property and white people placed in their path. African Americans' commitment to education had lasting effects on the former slaves-holding states. As voters and legislators, they played crucial roles in creating public schools for black and white in southern and border states in the late 1800s. As African Americans built lives as free people, in a free society during Reconstruction, they eagerly sought opportunity to learn. Before emancipation, whites generally denied or restricted African American access to education. Learning to read, therefore, became a symbol of freedom for African Americans. In the former slaves-holding states, African Americans had other reasons for making literacy a priority after slavery ended. Many hoped that education would improve their economic circumstances and offer some protection from fraud and exploitation. They also saw education as an important preparation for participating in civic life. African Americans faced significant challenges in their effort to create schools during Reconstruction. One problem was a shortage of qualified teachers. In the early years of Reconstruction, local African Americans who would already read and write shared their knowledge with family, friends, and neighbors. Americans who would finding a building to use as a schoolhouse was often a challenge, since few local white were willing to sell or rent property to African Americans to use as schools. For many communities, it was really hard for them to learn. One of the solutions was to use African American churches. African American congregations owed these buildings, and unlike most white landowners, were usually willing to support the schools. Despite the sacrifice required to send children to school, African American children filled schoolhouses in the southern and border states during Reconstruction. At least 25 students attended school. This number included 12 children who had been born into slavery. By the fall of 1872, African American children were attending a racially segregated public school. The establishment of public school in the former slave-holding states owed much to African American community to education. African Americans used their power as voters and legislature to create the framework for public education during the late 1860s and 1870s, which did not join the Confederacy established a public school system in 1864 before African American men in the state could vote. By establishing their own schools and advocating for public education, African Americans claim education as one of their rights as citizens. Their dedication to the right laid for foundations for public schools for blacks and whites. In Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, the Supreme Court outlawed segregated public education facilities for blacks and whites at the state level. The Civil Rights Act 1964 superseded all state and local laws requiring segregation. The fund requirement matching contributions from local communities. Even in the poorest rural areas, black men and women held fundraisers, donated land, and built schools with their own hands. At the time, they had limited resources that never met the tremendous demand for education from African Americans across the South and the North. Yet, the commitment of African American teachers and parents to education never faltered. They established a tradition of education self-help and were among the first Southerners to campaign for universal public education. They welcomed a lot of missionary societies, black communities, many desperately poor, also dug deep into their own resources to build and maintain schools that met their needs and reflected their values. There's a quote by Susie King, who attended a secret school in Savannah, Georgia. We went every day about 9 o'clock with our books wrapped in paper to prevent the police or white persons from seeing them. After school, we left the same way we entered, one by one, when we would go to the square about a block from school and wait for each other. Despite the burden of segregation and racism, some high schools and colleges for black students provided educational opportunities that rivaled those offered to white students. Separate public schools were often created for Asians, Latinos, and Native American children, where there were not enough children of a single racial group to form their own school. They were usually required to attend black institutions.